So the structure of American government as we receive it now is deeply embedded in the US Constitution, which was not our first founding document. The first one would have been the Articles of Confederation, which was the governing document under which the colonies prosecuted the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. But late 1700s, the Constitution is adopted, ratified by the states, and it is a document that is filled with compromises. And the system that we receive today, and in particular the electoral system that we have, owes an awful lot to the Constitution, and some of its quirks are absolutely the result of various compromises. And so the United States has three branches of government. There's a independent judiciary, or largely independent judiciary. There is an executive, and then there's a legislative branch. And Constitution by far and away spends the most time on the legislative branch, even though as things would unfold, we would, I guess, receive the executive as being the more powerful actor. Lots of checks and balances on those different branches. They're separate for a reason. They're meant to have various powers over each other. And it's actually meant to be a system that moves remarkably slowly. This, of course, would change with the arrival of political parties on the scene fairly quickly in the nation's history. Late 1700s again, early 1800s, pretty much shortly after the ratification of the Constitution. And this would really ramp up in the sort of 1830s with the birth of American mass parties. And since then, it's been a kind of a stable two-party state. There's been something resembling a Democratic Party, and then later in the 1850s, 1860s, a Republican Party would take the place of an earlier party called the Whigs. And it's been a dominant two-party system for the existence of the country, although there have been some third-party challenges there. And this makes things move more quickly than the original design was intended to. So it's a design that's straining against the development of something like a party system. In practice, at least during a very polarized environment where the parties don't get along and there's very few rewards or very few perceived rewards for compromise, they don't work together, as it may seem, particularly if the branches are torn apart by partisanship, if there is what's called divided government. So again, going back to the idea that there are three separate branches, they're supposed to have various checks and balances over each other. The legislature passes laws, the executive then enforces laws, and then the judiciary is there as a backstop in order to ensure that the laws are constitutional and that they're in keeping with the original understanding or the original design for the Constitution itself. So they're supposed to have these checks and balances over each other, and they're supposed to work in concert with each other. And that has been made difficult, paradoxically difficult and easier with the development of the party system, given that once one party controls at least the legislature and the executive, things tend to move more quickly than perhaps was initially designed. However, if there's divided government, if the legislative branch and the executive branch are split in terms of party control, things kind of move very slowly, and it's possible for the parties to gum up the works to frustrate the agenda of the other party, given that you need the executive to sign legislation and you need the legislative branch to propose that legislation. Of course, there are numerous workarounds to this regarding executive orders, but for the most part, they need to work together if something like ordinary legislation is to actually be created. As I think I mentioned at the outset, so many features of the American system are the result of compromises. The Electoral College was one of those compromises. So it exists because it's in the Constitution, and it's in the Constitution because everyone at the convention could see that they were not going to secure ratification of the Constitution if they didn't have some concessions to smaller population states. And those smaller population states were predominantly slaveholding states. And so in some ways it is a compromise, in addition to some other unfortunate compromises in the Constitution, that result in this strange amalgam of an institution that we have that's called the Electoral College. And it has changed over time in terms of how it works in practice, but it was initially designed in order to kind of balance various competing demands. And so it was initially set up to provide some counterweight to the pure population-based model of representation for the chief executive. And so it functionally is the number of electoral college votes that a state gets are the combined number of seats that they have in the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, and then the upper chamber, the Senate. And so you add those two together, and that's the number of Electoral College votes a state gets. It was originally set up to be a bulwark against, I guess, the passions of the uninformed electorate, if we can kind of read between the lines of some of the founding documents. Basically, it would be the idea was the best people would be picking president. They would certainly be informed, or at least largely informed, by the popular vote. But then they would have a certain amount of freedom to act as a brake against that if the public was totally off in left field and wanted some candidate that, did not have the country's best interest in mind. And so this was kind of an elite check on popular opinion. And it persists to this day largely because of tradition, and also because of some arguments remaining relevant regarding the representation of a broad swath of the country. There is an argument to be made that, I'm not saying it's necessarily a good argument, but there's an argument to be made that you want a president who can win in many different areas of the country rather than running up the score in just the population centers. So from a pure little d democratic perspective, absolutely not, particularly when there's a split, right, where the popular vote goes in one direction and the Electoral College goes in a different direction, something we've seen multiple times throughout the country's history, but twice in the last 20 years. Certainly not. And so if we care about the public writ large, no, it absolutely is not reflective of the will of the people taken as a totality. From there, it gets difficult, though, because of the argument surrounding, and it was, I believe, Hamilton's argument originally in the Federalist Papers about, hey, you want somebody who can win largely rural places, and you want them that can win urban places as well. You don't want them just to cater to one particular part of the country. And, it absolutely changes how candidates would campaign if you were to get rid of it. And it would change, oddly, it would change the importance of every vote. And so every vote is suddenly much, much more important. And every vote is going to be much, much more hotly contested. And maybe that's a good thing. And so there are absolutely reasons why it is an outmoded institution. And there are a handful of reasons to keep it around. And so you could really go either way with this. But if you're defining the will of the people as, the most voters nationwide, then it's absolutely not always reflective of that.